More than 6,000 children have been killed in Israel's war on Gaza. That poses a big challenge to their claim that only Hamas are being targeted. And in response, there's been a concerted effort by Israel and their supporters to cast doubt on the war's impact on children. Now, notably, that's involved the claim that deaths are faked. An example appeared on Friday in the Jerusalem Post. So you can see here, Al Jazeera Post's blurred doll claims it to be a dead Palestinian baby. Now here we've actually blurred the second picture as well. On the Jerusalem Post, it showed an unblurred picture of the face of a dead baby that, according to the Jerusalem Post, was in fact a doll. We are sorry to tell you, but in fact the Jerusalem Post was wrong. What you saw underneath that headline, if we hadn't blurred it, was an image of a baby, 5-month-old Mohammed al-Zahar. Now, he was killed by an Israeli airstrike. The mistake was brought to the attention of the Jerusalem Post, who deleted the article and released this statement. Over the weekend, we shared an article based on faulty sourcing. The article in question did not meet our editorial standards and was thus removed. We take this matter seriously and will be handling it internally in order to prevent similar incidents from reoccurring. We regret this incident and remain committed to upholding the highest journalistic standards at all time. You can see that's a somewhat vague statement, isn't it? Presumably the Jerusalem Post were too embarrassed to spell out the nature of the grim mistake they had made. To repeat, they published an enormous picture of a dead baby, and they said, this is evidence of Palestinians faking the deaths of babies. This is a man holding a doll. In fact, it was a man holding a baby, his baby, who'd been killed in an airstrike. Of course, there is no shortage of horror stories when it comes to the impact Israel's war has had on Palestinian babies. One of the grimmest was this, verified by Human Rights Watch and here reported in the Washington Post. Israel's assault forced a nurse to leave babies behind. They were found decomposing. And this is from the report from the Washington Post. It was the height of Israel's assault on northern Gaza last month, and Al-Nasser Children's Hospital was a war zone. The day before, airstrikes had cut off the Gaza City facility's oxygen supplies. Israeli tanks had surrounded the hospital complex, and the Israel Defense Forces were calling and texting doctors, urging them to leave. But ambulances couldn't safely reach Al-Nasser to transport the wounded, and doctors refused to leave the facility without their patients. 5 premature babies were particularly vulnerable. They needed oxygen and medication administered at regular intervals. There were no portable respirators or incubators to transport them. Without life support, the nurse feared they wouldn't survive an evacuation. Then the IDF delivered an ultimatum. Al-Nasser director Bakr Koud told the Washington Post, "Get out or be bombarded." So that's what the IDF told the hospital workers. An Israeli official, meanwhile, provided an assurance that ambulances would be arranged to retrieve the patients. So the nurse in charge of the babies at this point, as you can imagine, felt he had no choice but to leave. He was able to take one baby, one of the 5 babies, the one who he believed would have the best chance of survival without being attached to the oxygen in the neonatal unit. For the other 4, the nurse hoped Israel would follow through on their promise to bring ambulances or to take away the babies to safety. Now, Israel didn't follow through on that promise, and I should warn you, this next passage is extremely distressing and extremely graphic. So the Washington Post report. 2 weeks later, the pause in hostilities allowed a Gazan journalist to venture into the hospital. In the neonatal intensive care unit, Mohammed Balusha made the awful discovery. The decomposing bodies of 4 babies, eaten by worms, blackened by mold, mauled, Balusha said, by stray dogs. A terrible and horrific scene, he told the Post. He took video. You might have seen that video. It was blurred sort of on Twitter for a while, and there was a moment where people were wondering, is this verified? Is this real? Now it has been verified by Human Rights Watch, Washington Post. Just completely shocking, grim to read, just disgusting to, there are no words, right? Of course, horrific claims about the death of babies have been made by both sides in this war. You'll all remember the now infamous claim about 40 babies beheaded by Hamas, now wholly debunked. Similar claims were made by official Israeli accounts on October the 11th. The Israel Twitter account said this: "Infants and toddlers can't read the text in this video, but their parents can. 40 babies were murdered by Hamas terrorists. We know you'd do everything you could to keep your child safe. That's what we plan on doing. And then they had this sort of video which they'd made sort of in the style of a child's cartoon. On October the 26th, that same account, so the official Israel account, posted this. Trigger warning. Listen to the eyewitness accounts of the 8 burned babies and 1 beheaded baby, which were butchered by Hamas terrorists on October the 7th. Pure evil. So these, of course, incredibly distressing accounts of the murder, the abuse of babies, right? The difference here is none of these accounts were true. Haaretz this weekend published an investigation into some of the claims made by Israeli sources in the aftermath of October the 7th. So some of the more wild, exaggerated, shocking claims. Now, the article is in Hebrew, so I'm going to show you a summary from the journalist Dimi Ryder. That's sort of instead of showing you the Google Translate, which some people have found recently isn't always 100% correct. So it's better to go to a journalist who has translated and summarized. So Dimi writes, Liza and Nir, so that's the authors of the Haaretz piece, found no evidence to substantiate some of the most iconic horror stories from the day, including 40 decapitated babies, pregnant women carved open with her fetus removed, children bound together and incinerated, baby found in oven, and pregnant hostage giving birth. So all of those stories, which you've probably heard about, none of them have been substantiated or could be substantiated. So he is in the section I'm going to show you talk about the decapitated or incinerated babies or the babies hanging on a laundry line, depending on what version people have heard. So Dimi says, these appear to be variants of the same story, the most infamous one being a dispatch by an I-24 reporter who attended the first press tour of the decimated communities and said an officer at the scene told her they found 40 incinerated babies, some of them decapitated. Other variants included unspecified numbers of incinerated babies, babies found hanging on a laundry line. However, cross-reference data from police, national insurance, and the kibbutz movement shows we know of only one baby, Mila Cohen, 1 year old, murdered on the day, killed alongside her parents. Re-interviewed for this piece, the IDF spokesperson said that the officer misspoke by saying babies when he meant children, and suggested another officer was in shock from multiple arenas. Now, of course, one baby being killed is a tragedy. The notion of only one baby was killed obviously is quite sick in and of itself, right? But how many stories have we heard about babies killed by Hamas? All embellished with grim, almost satanic details, right? And they're almost universally put forward to say Hamas is ISIS, that's what Israel always said, or Hamas are the Nazis. And then they give these incredibly, they make it sound like a satanic ritual whereby they killed multiple babies at the same time, right? Yet, throughout the whole of the October 7th attacks, only one died. And as I say, only one baby, that's terrible. But if you think about the amount of stories we've heard about the different manners in which babies were killed, yet only one baby has died, right? All of those could be falsified by just looking at how that one baby was killed. It seems like I don't know how the stories managed to get away from the facts to such a great degree. And it should also be said, 5 children under 12 are so far also known to have been killed on October the 7th, as were 14 children aged 12 to 15. So, of course, terrible. But there was clearly a lot of exaggeration in the days after October the 7th, even by those who should have known better. Also, I should say, lots of people trying to shame anyone who questioned those accounts, which sounded somewhat outlandish and turned out not to be in any way substantiated. Ash, I want your thoughts on, it's quite a difficult topic. Even sort of reading out these things which were, it seems like they were probably made up about babies is quite difficult to think about, let alone the things which have turned out to be factual.
So I think I'm going to take them separately, even though they are related. One is the exaggeration and the embellishment of some of the atrocities that took place on October the 7th. And then the second thing is this move to delegitimize and cast doubt on the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. Starting with the first one about October the 7th, I think one of the things that's really important is that you've got two things going on at once. One is, I think, quite genuinely, you have an evolving situation where reports come out quickly, they're verified slowly. But instead of that happening within a context of journalistic skepticism, and that's not the same as callousness. That's not the same as not caring, but it's journalistic skepticism. And it's saying, okay, we're going to have quite a high threshold for putting out information because it's such a febrile atmosphere. What you had were two things working together. One, it was a massive propaganda project on the part of the Israeli government and the Israeli army, both of whom considered these atrocities as a reason and a justification to go off the leash in Gaza. So the more you pumped out these really distressing and very visceral stories around decapitated babies, or a baby in an oven, or a pregnant woman having a fetus, cut out of her, that these are things which shock and appall people, they disgust people, and then it makes the violence that you're going to do in retaliation seem justifiable, even restrained in the face of this very visceral barbarity that you're saying happened on October the 7th. Now, atrocities did happen on October the 7th. Many, many people were killed. The information that we're getting now, especially as some of those numbers are being revised, where some appear to have been killed by Israeli security forces, we're seeing that there was a mad rush to put out information that presented the worst case scenario as an absolute fact. And that's because it was in the interests, the political interests of the Israeli government. Because also, if you're dealing with a kind of satanic, unmitigated evil, it lets you off the hook for the security failures that got you there. And then the second thing it does is that it justifies a case for the kind of total war that you're seeing in Gaza. And then I think something else, another incentive is at play here as well, which is I think that journalists want to put out some of the most shocking information because it weirdly justifies their job as a journalist. They become a kind of ferryman or a mouthpiece for horror. And I think it kind of inflates their status and their importance. And so when you've got a confluence between that kind of career incentive and also a political incentive, the British and the American media establishments both are overwhelmingly pro-Israel in their editorial disposition. I think that you get this kind of unverified information being put out quite quickly. The second thing
I
is
just want to
about
say, before you go on to the
why.
second one, a thought I just had in terms of the Palestinian one. What really frustrated me here wasn't just that it got put out, but you would be attacked so heavily if you dared to question it, right? And what I always found is if you question something that the Israelis have said, it was acceptable. If you question something a first responder said, that was unbelievable, that was beyond the pale. And what this thread, so obviously I can't read Hebrew, but I've read that whole thread. I do recommend reading it, saying lots of the stuff that the Zaka rescuers were saying, and I don't know anything about their intentions. I'm sure what they did was very brave and very stressful, but lots of the stuff they told the media, there's no way it could possibly be true because it doesn't match with the hard evidence. Sorry, I just wanted to comment on that because I was feeling quite frustrated, but go on.
Mm. No. I mean, I think that's important, and I think it also highlights what journalistic work is. Now, I'm not going to speak to what the intentions of those first responders were, because even if you take away any sense of ideological affiliation or political disposition, these are people walking into situations which are dangerous and traumatic. I think that's just an inarguable fact. So I'm not going to put on those people the same journalistic standards of rigor that I would place on people who work in the media and also government and army spokespeople, right? I think that there is a moral and categorical difference between a first responder saying something that isn't true and a government or an army spokesperson or a journalist repeating something that isn't true. I think these are just totally different moral things. But what's been, I think, horrible, and I've experienced this a bit less, because quite deliberately I've been tweeting less, but something that you've been accused of and that Owen Jones has been accused of is when you step in with what I think is not just justifiable, but essential for journalists to do, which is draw a distinction between what we can say we know and what is verified and what isn't verified yet, or perhaps isn't verifiable or has been debunked. then you're being accused of something akin to Holocaust denial. But that's simply not the case. You're not saying these atrocities didn't happen. What you're saying is that there's a narrative in the media which is not being supported by hard evidence. Now, it may well turn out to be supported by hard evidence, or in the case of this horrible, ghastly image of 40 beheaded babies, it might end up being debunked. And it's your job as a journalist to do that kind of rigorous fact checking, regardless of whether or not, it's a nice job or a nice thing to do, because that's what journalists are meant to do. But when it comes to the Palestinians, and I've spoken about this before, there is this trope known as Pallywood, where in Israel and amongst pro Israeli advocates, there is a conspiracy theory that Palestinians invent and concoct kind of, spectacular images of their own suffering in order to garner the world's sympathy. So we've seen disinformation pumped out online, people taking stills from behind the scenes movie making and saying, oh, this shows evidence of Palestinians applying makeup to themselves to show, cuts and bruises and dead bodies. And this is something which has gone on for a really long time. Now, here's the thing. Let's say we find a, deep, one single image which isn't true, because you may find that. It's important and it's meaningful to say this particular image isn't true, because the role of verifying information, I think you've got to do it no matter what side that falls on. But to try and weave that into a wider conspiracy theory of Palestinians are actually making it all up is complete horseshit. Um, and it's something you come across again and again and again, particularly when you interact with pro-Israeli advocates online, and you sort of say, well, hang on, these accounts of Palestinian suffering feel plausible to me because it's backed up by third parties, NGOs, the UN. These are reports that have been done into, I don't know, say conditions in Israeli prisons. And there's just this sort of, quite lazy fallback line of, this is all Hamas propaganda. You can't trust a word a Palestinian says because they're always lying in the interests of Hamas. And I think the reason why you've got to, I think, maintain this frankly absurd narrative that Palestinian suffering is an invention of the Palestinian people is because if you were to recognize that suffering is real, Israel no longer automatically holds the position of moral legitimacy because, quite simply, it's a Jewish majority state which was formed in the wake of the Holocaust and World War II. Right? Suddenly, that kind of moral legitimacy is gone, and you've got to think about what it would mean to hold Israel accountable in light of this very real suffering. Now, when I saw the horrible images of that man holding his baby. Um, I can't I can't imagine what it would be like to experience that kind of loss. And then I can't imagine on top of that what it would be like to experience that loss and be called a liar on the front page of a newspaper and your dead baby's face plastered all over it and being told that's not real. The only things I can think of which are comparable are the parents of Sandy Hook toddlers who are being accused of being crisis actors by the likes of Alex Jones. Now, when Alex Jones did it, he was basically bankrupted by a class action lawsuit. He's seen as a kind of persona non grata in the world of serious media. But when the Jerusalem Post does it, they can issue a very vague apology and they're still going to be taken seriously by Western media outlets because the disposition of Western media outlets is to be pro Israel. And I think that's disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine the cost? Like, if you as a journalist put out a picture of a dead Israeli and said this is fake, right, and then it turned out to be real. You said it was a doll. It turned out to be. I think your journalism career would be in serious trouble. I'm not convinced that's going to be the case in this situation.